Thank you, everybody. Leah, for inviting me. James, everybody who's back making this happen. It's a joy to be back at one of my favorite libraries in the whole world, even if it's virtually. So today I have the pleasure of being part of this special session, and I want to get started on that, but just a quick reminder that it would be really great if you could type out your questions in the chat, so that when we get to the question and answers, we can go right to your questions, and we'll be able to call on you if there's time. But otherwise, please know that we're going to get to as many of you as possible. And I think that's it in terms of the housekeeping. So with that, I'll turn our attention to, I think it's Cristina who's going to go first.
Hey, thank you. Hello, everyone. I want to sincerely thank the Newberry for the invitation, and I'm grateful to my colleague and friend, Leah Markey, and all of the staff at the Newberry who made this very timely and important event possible despite the pandemic. This is a document, Pious Memories of the Indian Nation, that I came across many, many years ago when I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago. And I was really kind of fixated on a historiography of the Franciscan order vis-a-vis their kind of connection to images and image theory. And when I read this particular manuscript, I couldn't figure out how it could fit in that kind of project. So I abandoned it. And it just kind of lurked in the back of my mind for the next several years. And then Ilona Katsu discussed the manuscript a little bit in an edited volume on race. And then more recently, Peter Viella also cited it in his discussion on indigeneity and indigenous elites. So this symposium gave me the perfect opportunity to return to it in earnest and go through it and see why it doesn't fit actually in a Franciscan historiography, and what is it trying to do and accomplish actually in 1782. So it's written by the Franciscan friar Jose Diaz de la Vega, and it is a late 18th century proto-indigenous project. It's hard to locate it in the historiography. There's very little in it that logs the order, the Franciscan order, and it's very different from the concurrent histories that were being written by Franciscan friars associated with Propaganda Fide. It is rather part of the legacy of Lorenzo Boturini's early archival impulse and pro-indigenous project. And you'll recall that the Italian Boturini arrived in Mexico in 1735, and he became enthralled with pre-Hispanic history and an absence of an archive related to this history. So he got to work, and he started collecting pictographic codices and written histories and other archival material, including paintings and drawings and whatnot that might suit his desire to write a history of America. His plan was next in 1743, he was jailed by an intransigent viceroy, and Boturini never saw his beloved archive again. When he came out of jail, he went to Madrid, and there, he begged forgiveness and was not only given that forgiveness, but in fact, he became the chronicler of the Indies in 1746. And so as chronicler, he then demanded that his possessions in New Spain be returned to him. In Mexico, those folks who were in charge of those possessions claimed, obedezco, pero no cumplo, right? So they're not handing anything over. And so Boturini never saw those things. But the King of Spain saw the need for such a history, and he ordered Juan Bautista Muñoz to write it. And the Viceroy of New Spain then was ordered to recompile Boturini's papers and have them copied. It was recommended that this be done in collaboration with other documents pertinent to the history of Mexico. And so, Colección de Memorias de Nueva España in 32 volumes was born, with Boturini's personal papers taking up part of the first volume. Diaz de la Vega's Pious Memories occupies part of the last volume, the 32nd volume. Several manuscript copies survive in Madrid, in the Academia de Historia, in Mexico City, in the AGN, one apparently at the Bancroft, and then the Ayer manuscript at the Newberry. Diaz de la Vega's Memorias Piadosas is not very well known. It remains an unpublished manuscript, largely unpublished. As one person noted, it is virtually unknown even to specialists. It was first cited and discussed by Georges Badeau early in the 20th century, and then Ilona Katsu, and then more recently, Peter Viella has mined the manuscript to discuss not only the presence of indigenous elites, but how that very category was formed and deployed in the 18th century. So how was it organized? Well, here is the table of contents. There are 18 chapters, and it's preceded all by a prologue that really establishes the project as one rooted in proto-indigenismo. It begins with an introduction on how the so-called Golden Age was really one of misery and oppression for indigenous populations. Rather than a golden age, the author says, it is the century de plomo, full of cruelty, oppression, and inhumane tyranny for populations, made all the worse because they were denied the faculty of reason and hence deemed ill-fit to receive the Holy Sacrament. So he then goes off on a slight tangent and says, you know, all of these plagues and all of these epidemics, they're not all the cause of the misery that the indigenous population has suffered. In fact, even Cocolitli, which is the worst plague, was worst of all precisely because millions perished without baptism, right? So he really stresses this point. The first chapter deals with the first miracle with which the powerful hand of God arranged the souls of the Indians to reduce them to the knowledge of his holy law. And for this, he cites Sahagún's 12th book of the Florentine Codex. If we had time, we could ruminate on how the hell he got hold of Sahagún's Florentine Codex, the 12th book. And there's various kind of theories on how that might have been possible. The next couple of chapters then deal with the Tlaxcalan martyrs. And some of you will be familiar with this history. The children in the 16th century that were tutored by Franciscan friars and converted, that then go against their elders and reveal the idols that they kept hidden. And for this, they were killed by their fathers and uncles and community and whatnot. And the Franciscans really kind of took care of these young bodies and hailed them as martyrs. One might suspect that in fact it is Motolinia that is the source for Diaz de la Vega, but in fact Motolinia appears as only agent in the story, and rather he cites El Padre Marcos de Lisboa in su Crónica de la Religión Seráfica for the story, presumably because he didn't actually have Motolinia with him. The next 5 chapters deal with the miraculous apparitions and associated devotional images. So chapter 5 is Guadalupe and her appearance to Juan Diego. Chapter 6 is the apparition of the Virgen de Ocotlan from Tlaxcala, also to an indigenous man in Tlaxcala. And then we have the Virgen de los Remedios in chapter 7, the Holy Cross of Querétaro, the stone cross in chapter 8. And finally, chapter 9 deals with the Archangel Michael in Tlaxcala. The focus is not just on image, but on the, I call them the Juan Diegos of the story, right? So the Indian seer is paramount to the mapping of a prodigious landscape in America. And as Ilona Katsu says, the Indian was often at the center of these discussions in the 18th century, becoming malleable, a malleable abstract category in the intellectual battlefield of knowledge production, end quote. So our author dares skeptical readers to visit New Spain, to visit these sanctuaries, to engage with these, not just images, but the histories that involve the kind of indigenous protagonist, and then quote, tell me if the Indians have not have made no happy progresses in Christendom if they had not been favored by God and his most holy mother. And finally, if this nation deserves to be abandoned, disparaged, and deemed irrational, end quote. So the kind of history of the kind of spiritual favors through the apparitions of the Virgin Mary and of the Holy Cross and Saint Michael, the Archangel, and whatnot is linked to the kind of spiritual life of the Creole nation as well. The 10th through the 14th chapters deal with really exceptional native residents, from indigenous bishops and other male elites to holy women. Here it is important to point out that the bishops are far from indigenous, in fact. That is, they are either mestizos or not indigenous at all, but that's okay as far as Diaz de la Vega is concerned. It's also worth pointing out the role that visual sources play for the construction and propagation of this category, indigenous elite, and as sources for Diaz de la Vega as well. The colonial author offers a detailed description of 4 full-length portraits located in the Cuarto Chocolatero of the Colegio de Indias, that is the Colegio de Guadalupe in Mexico City, a school for Indian girls. Each composition, he tells us, had a detailed inscription, and those portrayed included Francisco de Siles, Don Juan Merlo de la Fuente, Nicolás del Puerto, and Don Juan Espinosa y Medrano, also known as the Lunarejo. There is another painting in this space or in this college, but it's in the entrance of the college, and it's a portrait of Valeriano, right? So these portraits are incredibly important. None of them survive, but I'm showing you some examples to give you an idea of what such indigenous elite portraits may have looked like. And who were these people? Well, Silas was a member of the cathedral chapter, important to the cult of Guadalupe. In fact, he writes the kind of protesta that accompanied Miguel Sanchez's Imagen de la Virgen María in 1648. And he also was the one who moved for an examination of the tilma by a group of prominent painters. Juan de Merlo de la Fuente was a bishop, and he's from Tlaxcala, but became bishop in Honduras, ordained in 1651. Nicolás del Puerto is framed as a Zapotec, maybe, maybe not. Juan de Espinosa y Medrano was born in Cusco and became a canon preacher in 1683. He was also a very talented literary figure and linguist. His inclusion in the Colegio de Indias in Mexico City marks this proto-indigenismo project as a hemispheric one, in fact. And then finally, we have the holy women that are included. And so for the holy women, we have chapter 14 that discusses kind of holy women as Vestal virgins, and how this is not a tradition that arrives with the Spanish, but in fact is a pre-Columbian tradition. And so he mines these kind of pre-Columbian sources, he says, and colonial sources, including Alba Ixtlilxochitl. And he says, you know, this was a custom to consecrate, you know, hand over your especially pious girl to a kind of cloister where she will have some kind of spiritual, kind of pious education in her life as well. And so the arrival of a convent is just a continuation of that, really. But he really kind of stresses, so that it's not lost on anyone, that there needs to be an indigenous convent, right? And we don't need any reminding that this is a topic that was kind of hotly contested at this time in the 18th century. And this leads me to the kind of end point of his project, which is several chapters that are dedicated to the Iroquois in now modern day United States, New York. And one chapter in particular dedicated to Caterina Tecacathuitla. And it's essentially, the source for this chapter is a translation, a Spanish translation of the original 1717 French edition of her Vita. And what is very important is that it's not just a translation, there's an extra section that is published with the Vita in 1724 in Mexico. And that extra section really documents holy women in New Spain specifically. And again, the need for an indigenous convent. It's that very same year that Corpus Christi is founded in Mexico City. So again, chapter 15 to 18 on the Iroquois also signals this as a hemispheric project, really kind of driving home and reaffirming the kind of innate reason of the indigenous body, male or female, and so well kind of suited to receive the Holy Sacrament, but also the kind of spiritual training of anyone in the colony and the viceroyalty as well. I'm going to conclude with just by saying that the Franciscan author reinterprets and transforms the Creole agenda, as others like Katsu have said, and Peter Villela, going to great lengths to exalt the indigenous body and indigenous voice. Fedot himself says in Spanish, El Padre Díaz de la Vega no es clavijero, tampoco es Poturini, ni es Beitia, ni concibió la exploración del pasado prehispánico de su país como una sistemática impresa de historiador. No era eso su finalidad. He made an effort rather to sacudir el polvo que cubría la dignidad histórica de sus indios. End quote. Thank you.
Oh, you're muted, Tatiana.
Oh, I'm sorry. It was, so thank you, Cristina, for that. That was fascinating. I want us to turn our attention now to Delia, please.
Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Tatiana. And I also want to reiterate my gratitude to Leah Markey in particular for the invitation to participate today, and for placing me in the middle of this excellent panel with my esteemed colleagues, Cristina and Manuel. Without further ado, I get to highlight this 19th century copy of a 16th century source on the history of Tlaxcala by Diego Muñoz Camargo, which was part of the original Ayer gift in 1911, and was, as I understand it, thanks to Ana Lu Maria Lopez, was acquired as part of the Phillips manuscript collection, itself originally part of a lot called the Biblioteca Mexicana, which was auctioned in London in 1869, which is to say, if you see the date here on this manuscript, not even 20 years after it was created. So the original manuscript, as well as a copy, are critical for the information they offer on the Altepetl, or the city-state of Tlaxcala, which managed to famously maintain its independence from the Aztec Empire. And the manuscript also includes this intriguing narrative about a legendary figure known as Tlahuicol, a heroic general in the Tlaxcalan military who was captured by the Mexica during the reign of Montezuma II. And Tlahuicol is especially known for his participation in a combat on the gladiatorial, a gladiatorial stone in Tenochtitlan. So his story, this story also brings attention to that Aztec practice of gladiatorial sacrifice. So here in this brief talk, I propose that this copy of Muñoz Camargo's manuscript is part of a larger effort to circulate information about the native past and aspects of the, within that, aspects of the Tlahuicol narrative in particular. So related texts and images served as fuel for the doctrine and legends of indigenismo, or the embrace of indigenous cultural expressions into a kind of a national community. Of course, indigenismo was a key aspect of the construction of Mexicanidad in the 19th and 20th centuries. So Muñoz Camargo's original was a mestizo author and translator. His original manuscript was written in the later 16th century as a response to King Philip II's request for information about the kingdom, his kingdom. Thus, this was a particularly extended version of the Relaciones Geográficas. The Newberry copy was made in the mid-19th century by Mariano Macedo, who was a government minister at the time. And it's also important, I think, to recognize that the main printed reproduction of Muñoz Camargo was not available until 1892, when Alfredo Chavero produced it in conjunction or in anticipation of the 1893 World's Fair, another wonderful Chicago connection here to this manuscript. So the Newberry manuscript falls right in the middle of this extensive genealogy of Muñoz Camargo copies, which I can't really cover in such a brief talk, but this central circle here presents the origins of the Newberry manuscript, since we learned from the author himself, from Macedo, or at least the cover page, whoever was the copyist of that cover page, that this was a copy derived from the copy owned by the historian Joaquin Garcia Balseta, who himself got a copy from William Prescott. And all of these copies, or the vast majority of these copies, were a derivative of the borrador, or the draft. And this chart that I'm using here on the left actually comes from René Acuña's 1981 reproduction of Muñoz Camargo's Relación, which was only rediscovered in Glasgow in the later 20th century. So you see that there's this sort of enormous, extensive family of copies. I wanted to make a quick material observation here. When I was looking at the original in the special collections, I got my special appointment in the middle of COVID to come take a look. And I was delighted to see this embossed eagle and cactus, the national emblem, of course, embossed on the upper left-hand corner of every page. And it just is a nice reminder to observe that Mexico, at the time of the making of this manuscript, was only a quarter of a century into independence, and within 5 years of Mexico's war with the US. And more locally, Tlaxcala was on its way to becoming a state of the Federation, which happened in 1856. So in some ways, we could see this object as part of the amalgamation of Tlaxcalan history into a national community. And then by extension, I would say the Tlahuicol story as well. Actually digging into preparation for today's talk led me to this, the discovery that the Newberry copy has its own very intimate family, including another text that seems to be the same, although not by the same hand, at the University of Cincinnati Special Collections. So the librarian there, Kevin Grace, actually sent me these pictures. I haven't had a chance to look at it. So I was thrilled to see that. And indeed, it's very closely related to the Newberry copy. And likewise, there's another sister copy, same year, again, by a different hand, it would appear, in the Library of Congress. So we're looking at 3 copies, which are all done in the same year, which is fascinating and I think warrants more investigation, because in fact, the one at the Library of Congress claims to also be by Macedo, but the handwriting appears different. So I would love to know from somebody who studies 19th century copies, not my forte, but whether we understand there to have been a team of copyists or what have you. In any case, just for fun, I thought I'd engram Diego Muñoz Camargo and see how his name appears in printed material in Spanish from the for the 19th century. And you can see, obviously, there are dips and valleys in terms of how peaks and valleys, rather, in terms of how often his name comes up in the printed matter. This is really just for fun. It's not scientific, but I thought I'd sort of see if I could understand what those peaks could be attributed to. And I think most importantly, I'd like to call your attention to the production or the versions and copies and translations of the Historia Antigua by the Jesuit historian Clavijero, who used Muñoz Camargo's text as a major source, and there were several republications in the 1820s as well. So the Newberry copy would fall right in here. Of course, it wouldn't be measured since it wasn't a printed copy, but shortly thereafter, remember that the copyist got his copy from Joaquin Garcia Casbalceta. So you can see that that influences other publications. And then of course we have the Chavero towards the end of the 19th century. All right, so I really wanted to, just as a sort of a last little emphasis on a particular area of the text, point out that Muñoz Camargo's text is the critical source of the narrative of the powerful figure known as Tlahuicol, who is an Otomi, made Tlaxcalteca a courageous warrior and a symbol of honor. In fact, there are a number of, or three major original sources for the Tlahuicol narrative. And Michelle Graulich is the one who's done the work on this. But I just wanted to point out that Muñoz Camargo is really the major source, the central source. The depiction that he gives of Tlahuicol is the one that is enduring, because Duran's Tlahuicol, as well as Tezozomoc's Tlahuicol, which is probably influential for Duran, is a much more, a much less courageous Tlahuicol. He's one that ultimately is a coward in some ways. This is a very Mexica perspective, Central Mexican perspective, but he ultimately flings himself off of the pyramid at Tlatelolco, instead of Muñoz Camargo's Tlahuicol, who's of course Tlaxcaltecan, or at least associated, his heroism associated with that Altepetl. So Muñoz Camargo's Tlahuicol is the one who fights to the death on the gladiatorial stone. So he's really the heroic one, the most courageous one. And if you know this probably most famous version, visual version of Tlahuicol, it's by Manuel Vilar. This is the plaster cast for the Academy of San Carlos. And it is, the source for this is attributed to Clavijero, whose publications at the beginning, towards the end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century, really become a source for the story of Tlahuicol. And interestingly enough, that the source that he uses that shapes his depiction of Tlahuicol is really Muñoz Camargo's, not Duran's and not Tezozomoc's. Of course, gladiatorial sacrifice is represented in both pre and post-contact codices. I've got a few examples here. Can't go into detail, of course, because of the time. So I don't want to ignore the fact that these exist, but in fact, in some ways, Vilar's depiction of a very heroic, very neoclassicized, idealized Tlahuicol has much more in common with these 19th century print depictions of gladiatorial sacrifice in terms of their, of course, naturalism, their heroic presentation of the musculature and the action of these bodies. And it's worth noting that the earliest is in 1820, and I would surmise that it's probably influenced to some degree by Clavijero's source as well. So all of this is to say that the production of the imagery of Tlahuitzol, and more generally the history of Tlaxcala, really is rooted in Diego Muñoz Camargo's text and the various genealogies of those texts, including the Newberry's own Fragmentos de la Historia de Tlaxcala de Diego Muñoz Camargo. So thank you so much for your attention, and thank you again for organizing this event.
Thank you, Delia. So now our final speaker, Emmanuel, if I could hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. So I was tasked to look a little bit into what it seems to be the longest title in history. This is for a sermon that was proclaimed in the Cathedral of Mexico City in 1681 in commemoration to the 21 martyrs of the Pueblo Revolution. And my presentation is focused more as a call to action to think about these documents and read these documents in alternative ways. And when it comes to this precise document, to think about it as testaments of native resistance more than anything else. So the history of the Americas under the Spanish is marked by a series of often violent encounters between native peoples and Castilians. If we are to understand a more nuanced version of this history, we must recontextualize the colonial period to include the series of indigenous resistance movements that constantly challenged the Spanish authority in the territories they administered. The Pueblo Revolt, or Revolution, of 1680 was only one of many native uprisings in the northern provinces of New Spain during the 17th century. I don't know what's happening with my screen. Apologies. Okay, this included the Tepehuanes in present-day Durango. We also have the Tobosos, Conchas, and Tarahumaras in present-day northern New Mexico, all happening within, again, the 17th century. And of course, the Tarahumara and the Pueblos who rebelled against the Spanish in 1680. The northern revolts of the various pueblos and native groups in northern New Spain have rarely taken into consideration as part of a long history of native colonial history. As Michel Roth-Trilot states, when reality does not coincide with deeply held beliefs, human beings tend to phrase interpretations that force reality within the scope of these beliefs. The Pueblo Revolution has always been recognized as a revolt to avoid admitting the realities of a failed colonial system in the northern territories of New Spain. In this myth-making process, the intersections between visual, material, and literary culture must solidify the forced realities that an organized indigenous insurrection truly represented. At the core of this intricate process, we find Dr. Isidro Sariñana y Cuenca's 1681 sermon titled Funeral Oration over the 21 Franciscan missionaries killed by the Pueblo Indians in August 10th of 1680. The funeral oration is an important historical document of the Pueblo Revolution. Here, Cuenca declared the Franciscan victims of the Pueblo's insurrection as martyrs and provided a series of theological justifications for the violence enacted upon them. Cuenca describes the uprising and, similar to previous Franciscan accounts, places the blame solely on the shoulders of New Mexico Pueblo peoples. He painted a picture of startling Pueblo violence, giving special attention to explaining and understanding the nature of Franciscan martyrdom, effectively erasing the violent evangelical interventions of the Spanish crown over Pueblo territories. Funeral Oration weaves a careful symbolic and historical analysis that, in the Foucauldian sense, produce the martyrdom of 21 Franciscans, and in the process erase what is now known as the first US Revolution. Cuenca's narrative reveals an individual experience of history, which at the time promulgated a new sense of ecclesiastical responsibility for the Christian conversions of New Mexican Indians, and also an enticing push to missionaries to be martyred at the edges of empire. Cuenca's theological justifications for the death of 21 Franciscans during the revolution reveals the zeal of these deeply felt Franciscan beliefs and a distortion of native resistance. By virtue of understanding the wounds of the martyr Franciscans, Cuenca developed a casual chain of significations in which Christ's stigmata was activated in the bloodied bodies of the fallen friars, the willingness to die for their faith, and in defense of the Spanish Empire depended in part upon this belief. St. Francis witnessed the pain of Christ in this vision of the crucified seraph, from whom he received his wounds. However, merely the scars of Christ's passion were imprinted on his body. He suffered not. The existing marks devoid of pain were solely manifestations of God's love. Violence visited upon the martyrs of New Spain was to compensate for the lack of suffering St. Francis experienced in the receiving stigmata. Cuenca's funeral oration contends that love was the only impressor of the stigmata. Something of suffering was lacking in them, which Christ suffered in his, end of quote. The pain absent in the wounds of St. Francis was instead to be suffered by the agents of his religion. The Franciscans, the agents of his religion, the Franciscans. Cuenca makes this point very clear when he expresses that, yet in the body of his religion, in 21 sons, not only was the love of God the impressor of his wounds, from which he willed that he should suffer, but hatred was allowed to do its work, end of quote. The violent death of missionaries such as Arvide, which is pictured right here, who died in Zuni, Pueblo in 1632, and the 21 martyrs of the Pueblo Revolution at the hands of the supposed barbarian Pueblo peoples was thus the necessary element for living out the Franciscan ideal. As I wrote this presentation, the monument that commemorates the 21 martyrs of the Pueblo Revolution still stands proud in downtown Santa Fe. Forced realities are still monumentalized in the popular imaginary. And unless we begin to recontextualize colonial history to highlight the resistance of countless Native groups by interpreting documents such as Cuenca's Oration as a silence of history, again to quote Rolf Trio, the scope of these beliefs would continue to uphold the oppressor's side. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. So it is now my privilege to articulate some of the questions that have been coming in for each of you. I have some questions of my own, but I will put them off towards the end. So first we have a question for Delia. Delia, Heather is wanting to know, what do you think that Muñoz Camargo's version of Tlahuicole was more popular than that of Duran and Tezmococox in later centuries? So why was that?
Thank you for that question. Well, I think that there are a couple of reasons. First of all, I think because the version that Clavijero uses is Muñoz Camargo's, and Clavijero was enormously influential. So that's one. But the other is that, as I said, Muñoz Camargo's version is the most heroic representation, and I think it made for a better national narrative, right? The end, the fight to the end, to the death. And of course, that motif of the gladiator sacrifice is sort of key to his heroism. So I think both of those are the major reasons.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. All right. We have a question now for Cristina from Amber Bryan. Thank you so much for highlighting this manuscript. You described it as a hemispheric project. I'd love to hear you talk more about that. What was motivating it? Who was the audience?
Hi, so thank you for that question. And when I mentioned it as a hemispheric project, it was in relation to the fact that this author, Díaz de la Vega, takes a source, right, that was written originally by a Jesuit about someone who was martyred, a holy woman in Canada. And the translation of that Vita he finds very useful for his own project in stressing the history of kind of the indigenous body in New Spain, but he never loses sight that it's part of a larger project. And somehow that kind of Boturini specter is always there, right? That this is going to be a history of America. And in those 32 volumes, when it was rewritten, in some ways, or written, it's done so with a real kind of firm purpose of being a hemispheric, but also in Díaz de la Vega's vantage point, being used to really stress the kind of reason and Christian soul of the indigenous body, period, right? And it could be a person in Mexico, or it could be a person in modern day United States or in South America. So that kind of proto-indigenism is something that he wants to stress, and depending on his sources, he's going to kind of pull from clearly manuscripts that are focusing on the indigenous body in other locations, such as the indigenous elite from, or so-called indigenous elite from Cusco, and the martyr, of course, from Canada. So it's hemispheric in that sense, and it's also kind of driven in some ways by more than any other Franciscan project I've ever seen in my entire life, more than any other Franciscan history. It's really driven by this kind of Jesuit approach also. Díaz de la Vega has no qualms kind of using as many Jesuit sources as possible to write this history. And I mentioned also the kind of lack of panegyrics towards the Franciscan friar. That's kind of replaced with a panegyric towards the indigenous agent, in many ways real and imagined, and hemispheric.
Great. Yeah, you know, Cristina, I was thinking about your hemispheric comments when we were also hearing from Emmanuel. You know, here we have the perspective of people who are writing primarily from Mexico City, who are reading widely documentation produced all over the Americas. And it's a testament to the involvement of the period at the time to really be kind of looking northwards and southwards in the way that we maybe forget, you know, what a kind of trans-American experience it was to live in a place like Mexico City.
Yeah, absolutely.
So following up on Cristina, we wanted to just, if you could please articulate the text by Juan de Artazum that connected that holy woman from New France to New Spain. Could you just maybe write that out in the text for us?
The title of that text, or?
Yeah, to write it out. The title of the text by Juan de Artazum, just somebody wants to know for the future. Great, thank you. So we have a question now for Emmanuel, so we take turns. From Sonia, it is great to see attention being paid to these paintings and texts from New Mexican history. I am from New Mexico, says this person, Sonia. I also find it interesting how the viscerally rendered deaths of these Franciscan martyrs counterposes later narratives, fictions about the kind of bloodless conquest of New Mexican colonial territories. So I think maybe the question is more, you know, maybe what inspired you, or what you're meaning to do with this kind of like reconstruction now based on pictorial sources and printed sources.
Thank you, Sonia, Tatiana. I want to say I was so nervous. I didn't think anybody, Leah, Ana Lu, and everybody in Newberry. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I saw the small painting that you saw, the Virgen de la Macana, here at the New Mexico History Museum. And there was an article written by Ilona Katsu dedicated to the cult of the Virgen de la Macana, but almost no attention specifically to the images of the martyrs. And that got me into a rabbit hole, looking and thinking about the history of the martyrs. And in all accounts, from the hagiographies to the chronicles, all the documents that exist on martyrdom, Franciscan martyrdom, it's always tied to highlight ideas of native, not resistance, but violence. So I wanted to rethink all of that long literary history and also visual history to start rendering sort of these materials as testaments to native resistance. And that's thanks to the approach to Michel Rolfe-Trullo, who always talks about the silences of history, always reading between the lines. So I always approach these types of documents, not necessarily as what I'm reading, but always trying to read in between the lines. And when you do that, you realize that there's a long history of native resistance, that it's always at the undertone of all of these documents.
Great, thank you. So we have a question now from my dear colleague, Cami Townsend, for Cristina. How do you think that he managed to get a hold of the Florentine Codex? I was thinking that myself, and I thought, well, maybe in Barcelona, but if you could answer that for us, Cristina.
Right, so I don't know, but the article by Georges Baudot, B-A-U-D-O-T, which is available online in French and in Spanish, has a short section kind of discussing this exact point because it really bothers him. And he suspects that there is a manuscript in the Franciscan convent, in the Convento Grande in Mexico City that he's looking at.
Oh, interesting. Great. So I'm just going to now take the opportunity to ask a quick question myself to Emmanuel. Kind of, as you can tell, Mexico City is on my mind because I've been writing about the city now for a year. But you know, Emmanuel, I've been reading a lot of the work of this author. And Señor Isidro Sariñana y Cuenca, and you know, he's a great describer. So you know, he has one of the best descriptions of the Viceregal Palace, for example. And so many other historians have kind of used him for, you know, our few 17th century descriptions of buildings that are no longer there. And I just love that, you know, you're, instead of focusing on what we more traditionalists are doing with this documentation, that you ran it kind of really bringing the Indigenous history more to the forefront. Just following up on this person, you know, we have so much documentation about his life in Mexico City and then in Oaxaca. And since he paid attention to his indigenous flock, I wondered if maybe we couldn't use him and some of his other production to follow up on what you're doing, Emmanuel. So not only this oration, but so much of his other work.
It's such a specific document because I truly believe there's a lot more in terms of what happens in 1680 because it created a jolt in the entire administration. I mean, people heard about this quote unquote revolt throughout the world. And it's even complicated because this document was translated in English in the early, I forgot the name of the author, but in the early 20th century. So people always cite this document when it comes to the revolution, but never really highlighting specifically that this was a sermon in the Metropolitan Cathedral. And it's so detailed when it comes to the theology. There's theology behind why they use arrows and the way they use arrows, where they carry their arrows, and what does that signify. So I think that I'm not sure if this answered your questions, but I think it's really thinking about all of those little details that allows us to think about this event as something much more monumental. And you're right, I don't know to what extent we can read all other of his documents as part of this long history. And during this period, besides the testaments of Pedro Naranjo, there's nothing else that we have on the Pueblo Revolution, which has been a problem. It's not till recently that we have some archaeological evidence of what happens before, during, and after that we can start constructing a little bit of a different history. So that's why it's important to approach this text with an alternative reading.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, what I was really appreciating too, Emmanuel, and also Delia, is you're bringing kind of heroes to just to see them on the screen, right? The imagery of the gladiator, and then of you just rereading it in a different way. So I wondered if other people have questions, if you could raise your hand, or I'll also try to be looking out at the chat. But yes, Cristina, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of get a sense from Delia about the depiction of that gladiator. And I saw that he's often paired with an archaeological object right, with the stone of Tizoc, and how early that happens.
Yeah, are you talking about the 19th century prints?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I've seen it. I haven't seen it early. It's clearly after the unearthing of the calendar stone, the 1790s. But yeah, that 1820 print, that Italian print, is the earliest one I've seen. There are likely more. I haven't exploited fully that corpus, but that is consistent in the 19th century and into the 20th century, that you start seeing the gladiator fight on top of, you know, either the calendar stone or something that looks very similar to it, the Tizoc stone.
I find that pairing very interesting, you know, because it's not just kind of imagining this figure, but also reimagining an archaeological object present in Mexico.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, the 19th century is the century of sort of collecting those archaeological materials and consolidating them into some kind of national narrative, so that if you can enliven them with this narrative that positions, you know, heroic, you know, in some ways, Tlahuico starts to look to me a little bit like Cuauhtemoc, right, of the 19th century, the way that you have the opportunity to work a body, an idealized body, into a narrative that's full of drama. It all makes for an excellent story. So add a little archaeological material and you've got it all. It's a whole package.
Well, I always, when I hear these talks, and I would ask this question. Oh, Emmanuel, please go first.
Thank you. It's more like a comment to both Cristina and Delia. I appreciate the historiography of the documents, because I've been thinking a lot about this lately, because when we think about the historiography of this history, we often what we see, it's the Creole lineage of history, and how much it is through the Creole collecting and the Creole imaginary that we have our own sense of identity, that it really comes together in the 19th century. So I wondered if you could, I mean, it's more like a comment, but I wondered if you can comment a little bit of that, because at the bottom of all this lineage, at the bottom of all this historiography, there's always this, to me, there's always this sense of Creole history that we still have with us.
Absolutely. So I found this project very difficult because I really wanted an Indigenous voice that was more concrete, right, than kind of what's there in 380 pages or so. And because it's, at the end of the day, a Creole project, and very much one. But hopefully, I mean, this is kind of why I included a couple of portraits, because there was this kind of self-fashioning during the 18th century as well, of the Indigenous body being hijo or hija de cacique, right? And so whether they were partially Indigenous or not at all Indigenous, you had people thinking about the benefits of being an Indigenous elite and performing that identity, right? So the Franz Meyer portrait is a wonderful example, but also the two examples of that portrait that I showed of a, mestizo, someone we would call a mestizo, who's being self-fashioned as a cacique, as an Indigenous elite.
Well, what I was going to ask each of you, we're almost running out of time, but if you could just quickly, this is something that I always want to ask as a follow-up in panels when I go to conferences is, well, how is it going to look like when you publish it? Is it part of a book project? Are these articles that you're preparing? Like, what are your thoughts in terms of incorporating your research on these materials for your larger kind of publishing record?
Emmanuel, I suspect that you're actively kind of working on this material for publication. Whereas for me, I see the possibility of transcribing this document and translating this document.
Amazing,
and really
yes.
making it known. Beyond that, not sure.
For myself, I would say that this is sort of a sidebar to something that a book project that I'm working on, that I'm finalizing right now with Adriana Zavala of Tufts. She and I are writing about the resurrection of Tenochtitlan in 20th century Mexico City. And that is where you see Tlahuical again come to life as part of this narrative of indigenismo. And to return to your question, Emmanuel, absolutely, we're talking about the amalgamation of indigenous people who are also, effectively deprived of their active participation in shaping their own best interests as they're kind of put into this national community. So, so this project, what I talked about today is really sort of trying to find out some of the backstory to a more 20th century project that I'm working on, but I'd love to pursue it farther and find out, especially about those prints, those 19th century prints, as Cristina focused in on those. Those are fascinating.
Yeah, I also wanted to say that, clearly lightning round doesn't allow for this kind of discussion, but I've been using this kind of blanket term of indigenous, and Diaz de la Vega is very specific, and he's, if anything, just kind of quite intentionally pro-Otomi. And very consciously so in terms of some of his sources. At one point, he goes off on a large tangent on the lack of real grammars and primaries for the Otomi language and how difficult it is. And he should know, he says, because he knows it. And the ones that exist, are not up to snuff, and they're all confused. And he gives several examples. And he ends by saying, we don't have a Nebrija yet for this language, and it's very much needed. And then for the sources that he brings in for, various sections, they are Otomi kind of apologists also.
Interesting. And what about you, Emmanuel? What are you gonna?
Yeah, I'm working on my book. But what I'm interested in terms of the structure of the narrative and the tone of the narrative is how it connects to captivity narratives of the 19th century. And the project that I'm working on is connecting the history of Franciscan martyrs to those captivity narratives, also anchored in the Southwest, and how they have that monumental conclusion in Hollywood Westerns. So sort of the tone, the narrative, the iconography of the anxiety of Native resistance, the pictures of the landscape that you see in this type of documents, they have this cinematic conclusion in all those terrible movies of the 1940s. So I've been thinking about Cuenca as I watch these bad movies at the same time, but they're all linked. And the thing is that when it comes to the US, sometimes we think about Protestant US imperialism and then Spanish imperialism, but there's so many links, especially when it comes to this territory, such as the Southwest.
So, and you're there in Santa Fe.
Yes.
Right. Well, wonderful. I just, a round of applause for all of you. Thank you for sharing your work. And we have another session following up in half an hour, right? So let me.
Actually, we're taking a longer break. We have a little lunch break hour now before the next panel. So actually, we will we'll shut down the Zoom in a few minutes so that it'll make it easier for recording the next session. And I'll come back on to do a tech check with the next crew at about 20:15 before the hour. The next one will start at 2 p.m. Chicago time. I wanted to just put a few announcements in the chat. I also want to thank this great panel. I'm sorry, I failed to do that. An amazing, wonderful discussion. I wanted to alert you all to this wonderful blog post that was actually just posted yesterday that Analu wrote about one of our codices, the Zempoala. Everybody should check this out. And also wanted to alert you all to our exhibition. I know most of you are not in Chicago and not able to see Viva la Libertad, but There is a great website you can study that tells you all about the exhibition. I'll put that in the chat as well now. But if you are in Chicago, please come to the Newberry because you can come see the show. And so come back in about an hour, take a nice break, go outside, see the sun, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
And feel free to stay on a few minutes now if you have questions.